Who predicted Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022? And what does it mean for us to be surrounded by informational nuggets and candies offering predictions? Are these predictions? Are they guesses? Are we overinvested in them? Do we have a fetish about them? Hello, beautiful community. Now from the vantage point of my own bed in London, I want to talk to you a little bit about this. Now, here is something weird. A lot of the people who failed to predict Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 had a better understanding of why the invasion would happen if it did happen than many of the people who actually predicted it. Let's talk about this a bit more. I've written a community for the Australian audience post on the main channel about this that I want to just bring to life a little bit for us. Now, what's interesting is that the people who were legit Russia experts in 2021 were of the opinion that if a war did happen, it would be centrally a regime security war. They were right about that. The people who predicted the war quite a bit in advance were often people who were predicting it as a national security war, which it could never be. So you see, this already raises questions about whether a poor prediction might not actually be epistemically superior to a good prediction under the description I've just given. Let's talk a little bit about this. I will refer to my community post, but I'll try to bring it to life for us a little bit. We live in a culture in which experts ceaselessly make predictions, get it wrong, and are ceaselessly invited to return and make more ceaselessly wrong predictions. But do we not also overestimate the value of correct predictions? Let's talk about this. Now, coming back to who predicted Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Quite a few people said it would happen, but for the wrong reasons. John Mearsheimer said it would happen for regime security reasons. I don't recognize that as a central cause of the war. Peter Zion said that it would happen for a combination of regime security and demographic crisis reasons. As a theoretical account of how states behave, Mearsheimer's position is perhaps more interesting. As an account of what the world's actually like, maybe Zion's position is more interesting. But both predicted the war, and you can put prediction in quote marks here if you like, for the wrong reasons. Now, some people predicted the war for the right reasons. For instance, Greg Uden predicted the war as centrally a regime security war and perhaps secondarily a war that was about historical mission and history making. That's my language, not Greg's, but it'll do. And Greg wrote a piece a little before the war, but he was saying this earlier too, that Putin's about to start the most senseless war in Russia's history. Now, there were others who predicted the war for less profound reasons in the nearer term. That's to say, in the run-up, in the months running up to the war, they just read political developments and said it'll happen without attaching it to some big story about exactly what the reasons would be. And here perhaps Dmitry Alperovitch stands out. And he, quote unquote, predicted the war in 2021, late 2021. He was right. How impressed am I with Mearsheimer's prediction? Not terribly impressed. How impressed am I with Greg Udin's prediction? Much more impressed, but what I'm really impressed with is the analysis behind the prediction more than the prediction itself. What about the more pragmatic, short-term, anticipatory prediction of Dmitry Alperovitch? I could throw in so many other names here. How impressed am I with it? I'm impressed. Am I very impressed? No. If it turned out that Dmitry Alperovitch invested $4,000 in an excellent top-of-the-range coffee grinder and elevated his coffee pour-over game to a world-class level, and he made the most fantastic, transparent, tea-like pour-over coffee, I'd be impressed with that too. Would I be more impressed by his prediction than by his coffee skills? Yeah. Much more? Not even sure. Not even sure. So we've got to begin putting this stuff in context. The more substantive prediction, right, really attending to the nature of the Putin regime and longer-term historical forces, right, the more kind of substantive prediction that Greg Udin made is interesting in the sense that it's a sound judgment about regularities in political life. But it's also just okay and nothing that special, in the sense that it's not a prediction because no prediction about the social world could be. A prediction based on social laws that are universal, exact, and general. Because predicting wars and revolutions isn't the same as predicting eclipses or the behavior of tides. I'm going somewhere with this, so stay with me. Consider the following statement. Every object attracts every other object with a force directly proportional to its mass and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Now consider the next statement. US Americans who support Ukraine in 2024 generally vote Democrat, but many also vote Republican, Green, and Libertarian. The second statement is not about all Americans. It's not about all periods. And it's not universal, and it's not exact. Most people know the difference intuitively. Most people know that social understanding and what we sometimes call the social sciences cannot be modeled on the natural sciences. But here's the sentence I want to land on. Our infatuation with prediction is an homage we pay to a fantasy that we can throw off the chains of interpretation, insight, and intuition when it comes to making sense of why humans do what they do. That includes why humans do what they do in their relations mediated by the institutions they share. So there is a scientistic fancy, by which I mean wanting to make social understanding like scientific understanding, even though it can't be, in our fetishization of prediction. There's a kind of aspiration to make the world capturable in generalities universals and exactitudes that could never capture it from the point of view of explaining the social world. And that's a very important feature of our attraction to prediction. That is exaggerated, of course, also by algorithms. Now, let's go back and say something about why I would argue the majority of legit Russia experts weren't as keen on the likelihood of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2021 as other predictors in the culture were. That's because they knew that Putin couldn't invade Ukraine full-scale without changing the nature of his regime, without to some degree shifting his regime from being, crudely speaking, what people sometimes call an informational autocracy, to being a much more totalitarian regime, a regime with more totalitarian elements. That's to say, in 2021, the Putin regime was unready for a war that couldn't be moved out of the informational environment at will if the regime chose to do so, because it was too big for that, right? What the Russians were doing in their warring in Ukraine and before 2022 and in their warring in Syria was stuff the regime could remove from the information environment. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine couldn't be that. And so either Putin needed to do it as half a coup and half an invasion and accomplish it rapidly, which looked spectacularly unlikely unless you were deluded, or he would be somebody starting a war for which his regime was clearly not ready, for which his regime has not been reset, which is why he had so many wobbles around balancing politicization and depoliticization right at the start. And so obviously the Russian experts who knew the regime got that, right? That the regime simply wasn't ready for a full-scale war. And that's why their crappier predictions are infinitely superior to the more accurate predictions of a John Mearsheimer. Because if the war was going to happen, their explanation of why it was happening would be instantly superior than Mearsheimer's, even though they were more skeptical about the war beginning than Mearsheimer maybe. These would have been people who would have been in the sort of ballpark of saying, well, Putin's going to do something. It may be an invasion of Ukraine that's not full scale. There may be bombardment across the entire country, but there may not be an attempt to march on the capital, right? They may have been thinking along these lines. So we've got to acknowledge that, right? You've got to acknowledge that the better analysis is actually the superior read there, even though these people said, I'm still doubtful it'll happen. And the others with the inferior analysis said, yeah, I think it'll happen. And we've got to watch out for our fetish about thinking that simple generalities can capture the world better than they really can. Generalities that are, things we spirit into social understanding from the sciences in a way that isn't applicable. Let me now say one final thing about this. So we've said something about this scientific fetish. We've said something about the fact that there's a more limited epistemic import to predictions than it may seem to be the case. Let's say something else, and that is that when somebody like me, in my infinitesimal capacity as a minor public intellectual, makes an argument about something that seems to entail a prediction, like my point that Trump is still on course for victory, even though, unlike Joe Biden, Kamala Harris can now absolutely win, and it's close enough for that to be more than a minor possibility. I still think Trump has the edge, unfortunately, and I do not like Corey Lewandowski coming onto the Trump campaign. But what am I actually doing when I'm saying something sort of probabilistically daft, like it's 60-40 for Trump at the moment? I'm actually starting with where I feel some of us are at in the community, and I'm giving us a gentle nudge that is, you're not under any compulsion to follow, toward the understanding that we're sliding into a more populist and authoritarian age, that we're always bound to underestimate the crisis of trust in our democracy, that we're bound to underestimate the degree to which destructive impulses will be increasingly more appealing over the next years and couple of decades to citizens. You see, that's what I'm really doing when I'm saying this. And yes, I'm also saying something about what I think is the more reasonable thought about how we see the outcome from, a few weeks out. But that's only part of a mix of, if you like, ethical intent, right? There's a lot of grounding intent that's quite frankly more significant in this point that I'm making, if I'm saying 60-40, than the 60-40 point itself taken literally, right? So here I've introduced another element, that there's a multifacetedness of intent in making a statement that looks like a prediction in a capacity that somebody might have as a public intellectual. So there is multifacetedness of intent, fetishization, and just the risk of overestimating the epistemic import. Now, I did this in 16 minutes. I know I could have done it in 5, and I'm grateful to you very, very much for tolerating that. Thank you for being with me. Lots of love. Till soon.